Hello, and thanks for joining us for Proximity's Malt and Brewing series. This session, we'll be talking with Kane Wille of O'Connor Brewing from Norfolk, Virginia, about Silky Stouts and the malts that make them. Kane will be discussing with us in particular his O'Connor Dry Irish Stout. We have Greg Fleehart, Proximity's Regional Sales Manager, and Matt Musial, Proximity's Director of Quality Assurance and Safety, joining us. To begin with, I would just like to have Kane share a few words about how he got into brewing, a little bit about O'Connor Brewing, and then we'll dive right into the topic of his O'Connor Dry Irish Stout and the malts that make them great. Kane, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been brewing professionally for a little over 10 years now. I came into the game pretty young, by all things considered. I got into beer very early, and found that I really enjoyed it. So it really just started there for me. And then I was contacted here by O'Connor Brewing Company about 6 years ago, and kind of was brought in as a hired gun, and have since risen, from a shift brewer to a lead brewer to head brewer. Now I'm director of brewing operations as well. We've been able to bring home a World Beer Cup bronze in 2016 and now a GABF gold in 2020 for the same beer, which is that's probably why I'm involved in this call today. It was very interesting to go the opposite way into the industry, and but I wouldn't change anything. I was able to learn every aspect of the business, and I think that that's given me a leg up in terms of, in particular, my role right now in terms of raw material acquisition and purchasing, and really understanding the business side, and then being able to apply that on the floor. So that's kind of my story.
What's your barrelage this year going to be, or last year?
This year, we're still sitting around that 15,000 barrel production barrels a year.
And you're a 4-vessel 30-barrel system?
We are a 4-vessel 30-barrel system.
Yeah, so you're doing quite a few turns. It's a big facility. You have a canning line, you have a bottling line, kegging system. So you're doing draft cans, bottles, different packages, which is a huge logistical nightmare.
Specs.
Yeah.
Some are pack text, some are in billboard boxes, 12-pack bottles, 6-pack, 6-pack bottles, in cans, in bottles, you name it, we're working with it. But this new facility that we're in right now is now, I think, 7 years old. So it's not really new anymore. And anyone who's worked in a brewery knows what a 7-year-old facility can start to feel like at a certain amount of time, cranking beer. And we are full on production. We enjoy the taproom sales, but our volume is out the back. We have distribution across the entire state of Virginia, distribution in Maryland, distribution in DC, distribution in parts of North Carolina. So
very big operation, and still managing to win big awards and keep your quality and consistency improving. Every time I have your beer, it's always better than the last time. So it was never not great. So.
Appreciate that.
And Kane's very involved in the local brew scene too. So Kane and I were contemporaries. We've brewed beers together in collaboration, hung out tons of times. He's one of my really good friends in this industry. Huge proximity malt user too. Pretty much every beer you guys do is a lot of proximity malt. And continues to showcase our products, which is pretty awesome. So we thank you for your support on that too.
100%. The malt is good. The malt is great.
Can't fault the malt.
Yeah, I'm always comparing things to that. How can we make that perfect dry Irish stout and then Americanize it into something that is so much different than that? So that perfect dry Irish stout is while it pours beautiful and has this wonderful dark color and this creamy tight head from usually nitrogen push. The color is all from roasted barley and a little bit of chocolate malt, but when you taste it, you don't get that heavy feeling, and that is so much what new drinkers think about when they see Guinness or in that Irish classic style. And what I'd like to hear from Greg and from Kane is how have they taken those classic styles like we just talked about and then used the different malt profiles to coax something that's people look at it and go, wow, this is what I'm looking for in a silky stout this time of year.
Yeah, Kane, why don't you tell us a little bit about the journey of ODIS, which is your O'Connor Dry Irish Stout. Was that recipe existed before you started?
That was an existing recipe that I have modified and evolved almost since the day that I got here. A lot of the differences that are found in the actual formulation of that beer at this point have been some slight modifications to water chemistry, as well as working so closely as we do with proximity now. In the past, when I showed up, we were pretty much a Breeze house, and we used a lot of different BSG ingredients as well. As that particular beer has evolved, it's really just been moving through exploration of darker malts. But in terms of ODIS in particular, as I've gotten more experience and as I've been able to explore malts from across the globe, really with our supply chain that we have now, I've been able to learn about malt. Not all malt is created equally. That's a good way of putting it. Now, stuff that comes from proximity and Breeze and raw and all this stuff, very, very, very high quality operations and all that kind of stuff. But the application of that maltster's particular technique and talents on the malt has a massive impact downstream in terms of not only how it performs in the brew house, but how it ultimately tastes in the glass. Weirdly enough, Norfolk has really great water, and we do, carbon filter it and do all that kind of stuff in the facility. But in particular, our water source, I think, is very much in tune to brewing stout beer. So that's it's nice having a little bit of a leg up there. Malt, in particular, in this case, from proximity, what it was bringing to the table. So that recipe, uses all of y'all's Crystal 80 malt, which we adore and love here in many aspects and use in many of our beers. It also uses the dark chocolate malt variety that you guys have. And I actually played with moving through the pale chocolate, the dark chocolate, and the chocolate malt that you all make. Then also uses chocolate wheat. But on the baseline, it's really about just seeking those traditional flavors while once again pushing the envelope. Is 6.3% ABV. Traditionally, dry Irish stout would have been closer to 4 to 4.5%. And with alcohol, there is more contribution, and it actually allows the malt to express itself differently. So the evolution of that beer has been slow, methodical, observational, and experimental in a lot of ways, because as you tweak and have your fingers on the dial with flagship beers, especially as someone that's producing at our level of production, there has to be a very soft and calculated hand behind those dials. Otherwise, the experience that someone had tasting your beer, a year ago, you want it to be identical or better than when they have it today. And there's a lot of considerations there that have to be taken into account when, fiddling with the tiny dials.
Kane, you make some really good points there. And thank you for sharing that story. I want to explore that a little bit more with you. So the ODIS is now using chocolate wheat, you said, correct?
Yeah, it's a pretty small portion, but it's enough to the chocolate wheat being a debittered malt just gives as people's palates have evolved, and as people really seek different flavors in beers than they did 10, 15 years ago, roundness is one of those things that I believe people are seeking after. As you talked about the birth of the pastry stout and all that kind of stuff, they're looking for less astringent, less tannic, rounder flavors, and that can be applied to any any style of beer, but we're talking about stouts.
And that chocolate wheat helped you accomplish some of that, huh?
100%. Yeah. It was just enough to give it a round edge.
Great.
You know,
Now so the C80 is in there, and what other proximity malts are in the ODIS?
So from the proximity feeling, we got obviously our base malt, because we are a silo customer. We got the Crystal 80, we got the dark chocolate, and we got the chocolate wheat.
So the C80 to me is an interesting addition in there. Curious as to when you started using the C80 in ODIS, what were the biggest things that you were after, and how were you able to accomplish it?
So the C80, you know, as we talk about any crystal malt, kind of like to look at, you know, there's a nice body builder there and a nice kind of like palate sweetness. You know, it does. There was crystal malt, a crystal malt used in ODIS, you know, before I got here, but pushing that crystal to just a slightly higher Lovabond, I think it just gave it a little bit more chewiness and a nice little kind of sweetness to it. And then, you know, obviously the fun thing about beer is it's all about the interplay. It's all about the harmony. So even though, you know, like this malt might bring some sweetness and you go, hey, wait a second, that's a dry Irish stout. It's like, well, my water chemistry is not supporting that sweetness. So it comes through in a different way. Because there are just so many variables to take into account here. So, you know, as for anyone listening, if you're, you know, when you hear the word sweetness, don't just think the beer is not sweet. I will tell you that right now. It would not fit style if it was sweet. It is quite traditional and dry, and you know, it has the right amount of bitterness to it. So.
Yeah, Kane, your stouts are really well balanced and very smooth, all the way up to like your Ibrik, which is a Turkish coffee inspired imperial stout, which is something I look forward to every year. Do you guys do variants on it? I think you brought over like 4 or 5 variants last time I think I tried it.
Yeah.
Really phenomenal, smooth stout. I remember we had a good conversation about water chemistry, pH specifically on that, which I think would be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about. And how do you?
I love it. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I found that too to be important. Obviously, pH was a huge driver in flavor and texture in beers. And also, when I was brewing stouts, I found the same thing, that having a 60, 80, 120 Lovabond crystal malt really brought out the depth of flavor in the roasted malts. So it's almost like adding sugar in the raw or Demerara sugar to a cup of coffee.
Yeah, like Carbonate.
To help it really brings out a lot of the flavors and the earthiness and stuff. But adding just like white sugar to a cup of coffee, it helps a little bit, but doesn't really bring out as much depth. So they're complementary flavors. And sometimes it doesn't even taste like you're sweetening that product. It just really brings a load of depth to something that otherwise would taste maybe one-dimensional.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you know, I've always, not always, but a lot of times I work with like a 4-3-2 model. So like, no, like, you know, really, really, really think about those malts if you're going to use more than 4. Never use more than 3 hops, and never use more than 2 sugars. And so it's just it's kind of the old KISS mentality, with, you know, caveats, and obviously everything's on a case-by-case basis. But I think you can overcomplicate your recipes, and then I think you can severely underservice them. Onto the pH thing, because this is something that is very exciting to me. Because it is so hugely important to brewing. And, you know, I know that water chemistry for a lot of people is intimidating in a lot of ways, and it's considered the final frontier. But I think that that's really extremely important to continuing to push the envelope of beer and what it can be, you know, in the modern age. So one of the techniques that I've been working on is, so when we talk about mash salts, we kind of go into this a little bit. You know, everyone's very familiar with calcium sulfate or gypsum. People are familiar with calcium chloride most of the time. People are usually pretty familiar with calcium carbonate. You know, and then you have sodium bicarbonate or baking soda. But the one that I don't think ever gets enough attention is calcium hydroxide. This is the key to brewing stout beer, in my personal opinion. So it's also called slacked lime, pickling lime. Chemical structure is CaOH2. And so now for anyone who's listening, food grade, you have to get food grade. And so you can a lot of times find it under pickling lime, used in that process for pickling. But it will raise the pH of your mash. And this is where this whole shebang begins. When you're dealing with super dark roasted malts, stuff that's highly kilned, high chocolates and all that, or high crystals and all that kind of stuff, you are going to be way below optimum pH when you're mash roasting. So traditionally, I know all the books, talk about either sodium bicarbonate or calcium carbonate. I really, really, really dislike sodium bicarbonate. The reason being, baking soda, Na, sodium, flavor impactor. Do you want salt in that particular style? It's going to come across in the way that you would have to use it to raise the pH of something that's going to be so acidic during the mashing process. The other one, calcium carbonate. Calcium, great, flavor neutral, good for yeast health, but notoriously hard to keep in solution without the presence of acid. So the measurable effectiveness of calcium carbonate, I think, is much harder to work with. So I came across calcium hydroxide, and I was like, ooh, very interesting, very powerful, huge game changer. And so basically, because it's flavor neutral and its impact is so high, very, very, very small additions of calcium hydroxide can bring the pH of your mash up to optimum pH. So basically, common lore is you're talking 5.2 to 5.6, right? With our stout beers, I like to really rest on the high end of that, so 5.5 to 5.6. This is for the American stouts, the imperial stouts. So I do something a little bit different with the dry Irish stout, and that'll kind of, I think, as I vomit onto the screen here, become more clear on why that's different. But so if the pH is low in your mash, which is what's going to happen every time you have this boatload of dark malts in it, below, like a lot of times untreated, like imperial stout can rest as low as 4.9 or 5. Your enzymes are not happy. Your enzymes are not happy at all. It is below where they want to work. But the biggest thing is your proteolytic enzyme activity is much higher. So this leads to a lot of like protein cleaving. And what that ultimately means is a thinner body downstream. And so you can try and counteract that as it comes to raising your mash temperature, 51, 53, 154, 155. But you are cleaving proteins when your pH is that low in your initial mash. And that is where the whole process begins for us at the brewery. Everything that you guys do at the malt house, we just take it and push it to the next step. But as soon as that grain gets crushed and hits that mash water, that strike water, that hot liquor on site, that is where our process begins. So I am of the opinion that it is extremely important to keep your mash pH in stout beer in particular on the high end of optimum. And it will give you a rounder, fuller, better body at the end of the process from the moment it hits that hot liquor.
So Kane, during the mash in process, how do you handle that? How do you handle your addition of salts, et cetera, to be able to get that? And how do you measure it through the process? And do you ever have to adjust it, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, water will fluctuate throughout the year, which source you're getting it from, whether you're getting it from ground or, surface sources and all that kind of stuff. But essentially the way that I train our brewers here is salts are never to be added directly to hot liquor water. They are to be added only once there is grain present and we are at a certain level in our particular mash tun. So we are mixing and distributing those, as everyone knows, these powdered substances like to clump, and you got to make sure that you break them free to allow them to permeate in the solution and actually have the effect that's desired there. So at the end of the day, yeast being this beautiful thing, and sparging and lautering and boiling, and the pHs are doing this throughout the process, and then yeast loves to do its thing and naturally buffer itself. And a lot of times, you're talking 0.1 pH differences on, different styles of beer at the end of fermentation. But I can't stress enough how important it is for that initial pH to be spot on. So the way that I do it here is I keep any more flavor contributing salts, aka the gypsums and the calcium chlorides, completely out of the mash. The only mash salt that goes into our stout beer is calcium hydroxide, pickling lemon. And then we can add it directly to the kettle. We can nail that on the back end there. But calcium hydroxide is and it's also a mash only salt that, or at least that's only what I've ever used it for. I've never really wanted to raise the pH of my boil, which there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, a nice high mash temp, I think, is really nice if you're trying to build that, final body as well. Like I said, I think that works in conjunction with the calcium hydroxide. So anywhere between like 154, 157 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 to 7 degrees Celsius is I think perfect for most all stout. You can dip down a little bit lower if you want to, but I think with stout and wanting that residual body, I prefer to be on the higher end of the mash. Totally alpha amylase, conversion. So now we've mashed the beer. Our pHs were great. We're louder, we boil off, we louder, we're sparged, we're in kettle full. pH once again comes into the equation here, because if we're talking about creating smooth, round, silky stouts, there's a lot of things here about the next. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. Well, tannic extraction. I think this is something that is huge. It's usually less of a problem with stout beer just because it tends to be on the acidic side of things. But, when you're dealing with these higher kiln malts, these dark malts, the friability is higher, right? So they like to shatter. And when things like to shatter, they turn into much smaller particles, right? And V-wire or false bottoms are only so good, correct? So I think it's very important to also keep an eye on your crush, because if you're completely shattering your grains, your false bottom might not be able to trap all of that. And then you bring that grain and that husk into your kettle, and then you boil that husk, and then you extract tannin.
And at O'Connor's, how do you keep track of maintaining the right crush?
It's a moving target. We have the grain sieves. We test as often as we can. Obviously, in different silos sometimes, different suppliers, all that kind of stuff. The plumpness and how it's going to go through. Here at O'Connor, we actually have it's a workhorse. Don't get me wrong, but we only have a 2-roller mill, so it is a moving target. I would love to upgrade that sooner than later to really dial in that crush. But it's just a lot of sieve analysis, making sure we're in the proper, the proper ranges for each of the screens, as well as, there's a lot that can be taken from observation. Like if you throw that roasted barley through that mill and you see shards, looks like fiberglass shards, you might need to back that mill out a little bit, because you're just creating glass. It's going to make it harder to louder. And then, like I said, it's, there's a huge possibility of bringing that husk into your kettle, and then you're boiling husk in which you're extracting tannin. Too much tannin. But, over sparging, obviously you're going to see a raise in your mash, in the pH of that, which is going to raise, your last runnings are going to have a higher pH, your boil is going to have a higher pH. And if you're above 5.8, 5.9, you're leaching tannins. You're bringing those in, not even in solid form, into your kettle, and then you're boiling them, and then it's going to make it all the way downstream. These things don't just leave.
One of the questions I had is, is proximity was relatively new into some of those recipes. As we've gotten into that, how's the consistency been, and were there any changes that you saw you had to make?
Very little changes. No, I mean, I worked closely with you guys. We were, I think, an earlier adopter of proximity here on the East Coast. You know, but no, you know, and anything that I've ever needed to talk to you guys about, you guys have, you know, answered my phone call, and that's the best thing in the world. So, yeah. One more thing I did want to bring up, because we're not quite done with the brewing process. So, okay, so we're talking about pH again, because once again, I think this is extremely important. Now we're talking about your boil pH, okay? So, and what's the other thing that's going to, that we haven't really spoken about yet, was, you know, yeast, that's in the cellar, right? But what's the other hot side ingredient? What I wanted to talk about was that boil pH, because at what point you add the hops and the pH of your kettle is extremely important to that downstream roundness and softness, and you know, that full picture of what ends up in the glass. So hops raise the pH, and I don't feel like a lot of people know this. If you were taking cellar, you know, data data in the cellar every single day, you're going to see, okay, you know, you're sitting at 4.2, and all of a sudden you dry hop a beer and you're at 4.5. That was because of the hops. Hops raise the pH. They do the same thing in cellar as they do in the kettle. So with a higher pH, you know, like let's say you're in the kettle and you're 5.5, 5.6 even, what's happening there is the solubility increases as the pH rises. So you're going to have increased utilization, which on the top you think, oh, great, utilizing the hops more. Not always a good thing, because it's going to also increase your bitterness extraction and your perceived harshness in that bitterness in the final product. So with that being said, I think it's very important to make sure that your boil pH is closer more to like the 5.2 mark before you add your bittering charge. And that will help you down the line to have a smoother bitterness no matter what hops went into it.
That's a good point. How do you measure it and control it there? Will you actually make changes during each batch to batch?
Not so much batch to batch, but when you know, with ODIS in particular, it's a flagship. We brew this beer regularly. You know, we have a lot of experience with brewing it. But you know, the sample is pulled, you know, and you're getting your pre-boil, you know, sample. You know, you want to obviously check your extract and all that kind of stuff. It's put through a wort chiller. We get the extract. We test the pH. And that will allow us to see if anything is potentially out of whack. So basically, what I was talking about earlier, like in particular with stout beer, you know, the only thing that goes into the mash is that calcium hydroxide. So what's going into the kettle are the other beautiful salts, the calcium sulfate and the calcium chloride, and those will drive your pH down. So you 9 times out of 10, per the addition of the calcium sulfate or the calcium chloride, your pH will fall into line with where you want to be before you add your hops. I would say extremely rarely do you ever have to worry about like sort of like weak acid introduction, like a little bit of lactic acid to the mash or anything like that, particularly with stout beer, once again, because it already lends on the acidic side. But it is an important consideration, and I think that particular point moves outside of just stout beer brewing. You do not want to be entering your bittering charge at a high pH in your kettle. You will feel that on your tongue down the line.
As I talked about earlier, you know, that the dry Irish stouts is kind of where I learned about things, and then have really enjoyed what the American craft beer scene has done with it since then. So, Greg, I don't know if you have much experience in your previous life about taking those traditional styles and then turning them into what a lot of people might refer to as these pastry stouts or dessert stouts, and how you might change the grain bill around to match up with that.
Yeah, you know, I think I mirror exactly what Kane said about pH and roundness and softness, and I think that's been something that Kane, on our generation of brewers, have really started to look at as more and more important, rather than just adding a bunch of lactose or adding a bunch of adjuncts, but really looking at the process as how it can make your beer better, just from simple process. Then from there, once you have that down, building on that beer a little bit more. So obviously lactose is a big thing right now in big stouts, and that's existed in the sweet English stout for a long time, the milk stout. And that can be a really good benefit, but you have to know what that does and how it affects your beer. And it's not as sweet as people anticipate it's going to be. So lactose itself is more of a creaminess in a body and a slight sweetness. I have had some success with high additions of lactose, high additions of flaked oats. Malted oats from Proximity are fantastic for that and building that creaminess in that body. Reiterative mashes, where you're basically taking your first runnings off of a mash, pushing them over to your kettle, getting those to strike temp, and then striking a whole nother mash with that wort to build your Play-Doh total. I think Firestone Walker started doing that. I know Jamil at Evil Twin, not Evil Twin, but
I know a lot of breweries that had to do that because they lost their hard liquor tank.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That was the only thing they had left was the wort that they had, so they had to mash into the wort that they already had.
It's pretty crazy how much you can get in terms of Play-Doh. You can almost double your Play-Doh. It's almost completely adds X to Y. It's wild, and you do get some intense body on that too. But I've seen that. I've seen and done. One of the brewers I worked with had a pretty successful sweet imperial stout, pastry stout, where he introduced probably about 15% Crystal 15 to the beer, which I was skeptical of, but it really did bring out the sweetness and the maltiness and got it more towards that pastry realm with the beers. And I think there's so many great debittered malts out there right now. So really, really low intensity, but really smooth espresso flavors, like the chocolate wheat, anything dehusked. And now that we have, lots of maltsters out there have pretty incredible lines of roasted malts and huge scales of roasted malts. So knowing your ingredients and your suppliers, knowing what they do, how they taste, I think that's what really separates great recipe builders from average recipe builders, people who are looking for the best malts.
Do you think you could do that with our realm of chocolate malts, where we've got a chocolate rye for some dehusk, we've got some chocolate wheat, some crystal of both wheat and rye, but then in just the regular barley malt, we have pale chocolate, and dark chocolate.
I think Proximity has probably one of the most extensive lines of roasted malts for dark beers. Even the base malts, you can go, our mild malt is fantastic. Our red malt you can use as a base. Vienna, Munich.
You guys are fun. It's funny. I was like, what Proximity malts have I used? I typed this out earlier.
There you go.
I remember, Kane, when we talked, I was like, hey, we got this thing going on last end of the year. It's 15% off any malt you haven't used before. And we went through the whole list, and I was like, there's like nothing you haven't used.
As a malt focused brewer, like, it's all about that exploration. I love trialing new malts. I love doing new things. I love seeing how they react and how I can utilize this tool, which is what it is, to create something that people love.
So I think we've been at this for a little bit, and we should probably wrap it up. But I do want to close it with getting a couple of statements from each of you, and that is, I learned this. This is a technique that Joe Hertrick taught me when I worked for him. So give me your top three. He said we can always remember things in three. So Greg, if you were going to be starting off with a brand new sweet stout recipe, what are the three things that you would focus on?
I would focus on selection of the proper base malt. So what I'm trying to achieve, how it's going to affect body, flavor, texture, pH as well. So I focus on selection of a base malt that's appropriate for that beer. Selection of specialty malts, specifically what roast and at what level. And if there's any crystal malts that need to complement that, but really finding the best roasted malt possible, which I think, proximity is a huge competitor in that arena. And then process is the third one. So that it comes down to really about pH and treating your beer gently and nicely throughout the process.
So same question to you, Kane. What three things would you say are the important things to get those silky stouts?
To get those silky stouts, water chemistry is huge. And then in conjunction with that, as Greg mentioned, the base malt selection is actually very, very, very important. Not all base malt is created equal. So yeah, water chemistry, base malt, and then really at that point it is, specialty malt selection and honestly, I would say the use of the Congress mash to help you really figure out what's going on, because a chocolate from you guys might be at 425 low bond, but a chocolate malt from the UK might be 325 low bond. I think roasted barley might be the greatest example of the widest variance of quality of any malt in the world. Someone's interpretation of roasted barley compared to someone else's interpretation of roasted barley, there's a football field with roasted barley in particular. So use a Congress mash, understand your malts, learn your malts. Don't be afraid to change your malts. But you got to do a little research on it. Even as a COA is not going to give everything you need to know.
Well, we've been going for about an hour now, and Susan, we'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Matt. That was a wonderful way to wrap up. And Kane, we so appreciate you joining us for this session of Malt and Brewing, Silky Stouts, and sharing with us all of your head and heart that you bring to creating ODIS and other stouts at O'Connor Brewing. I'd like to also thank Greg Fleehart and Matt Musial. It was a great session. We look forward to sharing it with brewers out there and look forward to hearing people's feedback as well. Thank you.